Thank you all for coming. My name is Callum Peebles. I'm director for Blue Shield International. I worked with the Halo Trust since 2003 until 2025. I was working with one of my colleagues here, Andrew Moore, latterly as Director of Programs. I'm going to introduce speakers, but I also want to introduce the idea that people can talk. I'd like to have this as a discursive kind of briefing because it's a new area, I hope of interest to you all. So thanks for coming. Our first speaker on the far side there is Peter Stone. Peter's the UNESCO Global Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace. He was previously director of the International Heritage Centre for Cultural Heritage Studies at Newcastle University, prior to which he worked for English Heritage as a field archaeologist and as a history teacher. He was honorary CEO of the World Archaeological Congress. In 2003, he was advisor to the UK's Ministry of Defence regarding the protection of cultural property in Iraq. He's published widely on heritage management, and one of his articles led directly to the establishment of the Cultural Property Protection Unit in the UK military. He also has advised the UK government on the ratification of all parts of the 1954 Hague Convention, which we'll hear about later. Andrew is a former professional opera singer who has worked for Halo since 2005. It comes up, it was on your bio. He's managed demining operations, it says in a few countries, but I know it's many, many across the world. In his previous roles as director for Europe for Halo, Andrew was responsible for private fundraising. He was director of private fundraising communications with Halo from 2017 to 2020. He's now director for all operations in the Middle East, so a pretty busy job at this time, and has spoken regularly on matters relating to conflict and recently as an expert witness at the UN Security Council. Finally, Steve is a former British Army ammunition technical officer, and he's worked with both Halo and the Mines Advisory Group across Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Since 2023, he's served as MAG's Global Technical Advisor, providing senior technical leadership across MAG's country programs. In this role, he's responsible for innovation initiatives, operational safety, and leads MAG's technical experts in the development of standards, training, and mechanical capabilities. He also represents MAG on IMAS review boards and leads the harmonization of global standard operating procedures. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I just wanted to do a quick introduction to you all before handing over to the speakers, and why are we here and why is this subject important and relevant to this audience? I was saying to some of my colleagues, my former colleagues last night, that actually it's interesting in the mine action sector, we work in and around some of the most significant historical sites on the planet, but perhaps we don't really pay much attention to that. My first landmine that I cleared in 2003 was at Prasat Prevahir Temple in Cambodia, and you can see here Angkor Wat Temple, which was cleared also by members of MAG and Halo, and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I know Andrew's going to be talking about clearance of Timurid minarets in Herat, and also clearance of the Bala Hissar fort in Afghanistan, where Halo was working in partnership under my leadership at the time with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. So the mine action community has been making places like this safe for decades. So Leptis Magna in Libya, Hatra in Iraq, Crusader castles in Lebanon, 16th century Mostar Bridge in Bosnia, and countless other mosques, churches, and other sacred historical spaces that are key to or part of humanity's identity. So as we look forward, we see the destruction of places like Gaza and Syria, and as you will all know and be familiar with, in post-conflict environments, we see people trying to return to normality, and part of their cultural heritage is that normality that they're seeking. So this speaks to the second point before I hand over to our speakers. What are we trying to achieve here? My hope is that we consider that mine action work ultimately is aiming to achieve safe and resilient communities. So we clear land to create a springboard for other humanitarian operators, for health, for education, for agriculture, whatever. What we're trying to do is create the prospect for economic development. We want communities to be as resilient as possible without outside assistance. We want to create those peaceful environments that people can live in and have some form of social cohesion so that normality can return. So this panel, I think, just in terms of today, we're talking about one humanity, which is the idea of integration for all. And so I think this speaks volumes in this space. So today I hope that we can raise awareness of the links between cultural heritage and mine action so that we can integrate heritage protection a bit better in the mine action sector. For example, in the International Mine Action Standards, there is no mention whatsoever of cultural heritage, even though we all work in and around important historical sites. Seems like an oversight, particularly as we're trying to do no harm. In December 2023, you may be interested to know that there was a unanimous decision by the 135 states parties to the 1954 Hague Convention, which is on cultural property protection in conflict, to highlight, as a quote, "with grave concern, the serious threat posed to cultural property by landmines, IEDs, and UXOs." So there is legal consideration of landmines in treaties other than the Ottawa Convention. And also, it's interesting for me personally that UNESCO is the one notable major UNESCO UN organization that is not part of the cluster system, which I think sort of points to the underappreciation of this important topic. So finally, I think I would hope that we can, with my guests here, we can talk about the prospect for research, for learning a little bit more from each other, and also potentially to work together a little bit more. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my first speaker, Steve, and in the hope that I've got the right slides. I do. So over to you, Stephen. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Good morning. So this is a subject that's really close to my heart, actually, because my base degree was in ancient history, and I'm not exactly sure how I ended up here, but MAG has worked across a huge number of different cultural and heritage sites over its 30-year history. And I could talk about, I've said that I work in Angkor, in the long distant past, recent work in Mosul and Tel Afar and Tel Kif in northern Iraq, sites in Lebanon or Sri Lanka. But for this, slightly opposed to Halo, I want to talk about Southeast Asia and some of the work there. And my part of this presentation is to an extent just setting the scene a little bit and concentrating on some of the benefits of clearing cultural heritage sites, primarily talking about the economic development opportunities, so the creation of jobs and tourism, and then talk about a bit about social cohesion and community resilience that comes from the clearance of these sites. So I'm going to run through a few examples. So the first on screen you'll see is from Vietnam. So a 19th century fort on the banks of the Quang Tri town in Vietnam. So the citadel was once hosted the administration of the local Vietnamese authorities and later by the French during their occupation. Primarily, this citadel is known for some of the fiercest fighting during the Vietnam War, during the second battle of Quang Tri, between the communist forces against South Vietnam and its US allies. So during the conflict, on this site alone, over 300,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the site. And the work that MAG did in the area was over 100,000 square meters cleared, about 25 football fields worth of clearance. And from that, we found 325 explosive items of all cluster munitions. And this site really highlights something that you've seen from a lot of areas where even this long on from the conflict in Vietnam, we're still clearing these cultural heritage sites just because of the complexity, and also that communities want to use these sites as soon as possible when they get back into their environments. And for many years, the paths were roped off in this citadel, but there still lurked the cluster munition threat underneath the surface. So, talking about the benefits of this clearance, and something that in reality didn't actually take MAG too long to clear, to go through this site. It's less than a month or two. But this site receives over 2 million visitors per year, obviously. Vietnam is a very popular tourist destination, and from a diplomatic perspective, this handover ceremony, it represents not only a milestone for safety of the community, but really symbolised that transformation of a former battlefield into a place of peace. You know, where people can now walk, learn about their cultural heritage, and it's just 2 days after clearance, there are over 5,000 people gathering to watch some of the one of the films, Red Rain, an epic performance that recreates the 1972 battles. So it points towards not only an economic and social cohesion benefit, but a diplomatic and a healing process for communities. And now the site receives nearly 10,000 visitors every couple of days. Moving on, a little bit left, over to Lao PDR. So MAG was also part of the clearance of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Plain of Jars in Xinjiang province. So it consists. This site is actually drafted over a large geographical area, and there's multiple sites. To be honest, I can't even remember how many are there when I worked at them, but this is well over 50. And for the Brits in the room, it's the equivalent of Laos Stonehenge. It's a very mysterious site. It's estimated through using optical stimulated luminescence that it's around 1240 to potentially 660 BC, and it represents a real deep cultural history for Lao PDR. Again, got some statistics on the board, but over 60,000 square meters cleared. Visually searched was 250,000. But the amount of EO, so cluster munitions found on this site, was around 175 items. And to highlight these areas, in these areas we're working really close to the cultural heritage sites. All these jars, which are effectively burial urns for the local population, many years ago, we were destroying items right up close. So it took a lot of effort for the teams to understand the cultural heritage, and it was essential that we engaged with archaeologists at the first point of the process. And as you can see the picture on the left, that it's very difficult for us to know what is simply a stone or was part of the jar's history. So in every step of the process, the clearance teams were engaged with the archaeologists to say if something's piece of the monument or it's not. And in this case, we found 50,000 scrap items on this task site, and not all of those are going to be individually inspected by an archaeologist, but a huge number of those were. And it's a process of stepping back, processing the items, and it highlights how these task sites' efficiency in some ways goes out the window when the primary effectiveness of the clearance is ensuring cultural heritage. And this site now receives around 43,000 tourists per year. Before, Xinjiang was apologies to any Laotians in the room, it was a bit of a cultural backwater to some extent, and now it's got huge amounts of tourists visiting that site, which is very much off the beaten track in Lao. So just to summarise, it's hard to underemphasise the economic development benefits and tourism job creation on some of these sites, and it may seem like a priority in many cases to clear a hospital or a school, and no doubt that's a hugely important steps, but it shouldn't be undervalued, the value that cultural heritage can bring to the sites, and not only from a social perspective but also community resilience. I can't underemphasise that you've got to ensure that your archaeologists, whenever possible, are there from the beginning, and that you have strict procedures when you're managing these sites. Protective works, use of low water techniques, and cataloguing items and scrap, inverted commas, found is extremely important. And it's ensuring that you're prioritising areas that will follow up by rebuilding efforts. And just an example, a lot of the smaller cultural heritage sites are lost, and this is another example from Laos, a stupa from the 15th century. And this is, again, it's in Xinjiang province, in the relatively middle of nowhere in Kun district, but to the local village population, this represents a really significant gain, and it's a small scale thing, but now at the point they're looking at a small visitor centre, building toilets, building community tourism shops on the entrance, and these small clearance projects can have a real massive effect, which is kind of lost when you start to look at it in large beneficiary numbers. And I've just thrown it in there at the end. I know it's not cultural heritage, but the same principles, in my opinion, go towards animal migration areas in places like Zimbabwe and Angola, where explosive ordnance has restricted animal movements across boundaries. But I'll hand over to Andrew, who can talk about more Middle East.
Give me a second to run the presentation. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Stephen, and apologies for the juggle with the slides. We have a slightly antiquated slide deck in Halo. I'm going to talk first about the site of Jesus' baptism, or the believed site of Jesus' baptism on the Jordan River in the West Bank near Jericho. And I think this is interesting because it provides perhaps a contrast to some of the points that Steve has made. I'm going to talk about how, in an extremely complex political environment, we were able to build a coalition of stakeholders across all groups affected in this area to complete this work. It could not have been done without that. So the baptism site is on the West Bank. It's known as Qasr al-Yahud in Arabic, which is the Castle of the Jews, and it falls within Area C of the West Bank, so it is under full Israeli security and administrative control. There have been records of monasteries on the site since 400 AD, but actually the churches that are at the site now all date from the 1930s, the British Mandate, when parcels of land were given to 8 different Christian churches to build properties. Not all of them chose to exercise that right, and some of the plots are not developed as yet, but others did build churches on the site. The site remained one of pilgrimage until the 1967 Six-Day War, and after that war, the site became a military restricted zone. 2,600 mines were laid by Israel around the site, in and around the site, and during the war it was shelled, and it was believed that booby traps were used in the site. So there were UXOs in the compounds and booby traps. In 2015, the then Israeli President Rivlin, made a commitment to Pope Francis that he would protect the site and open it as a site for all faiths. It does sit within a national park. And the real challenge was doing this in a way that had full ownership from all parties. It was entirely possible to clear the site with purely under Israeli jurisdiction, but of course that wouldn't fit within our principles, and it would not have left the site secure for future generations. So we set about building a framework that included everybody to clear this site. The PA had an interest, the Palestinian Authority, because it would increase visits to Jericho and increase tourism, increase the economy, improve the economy of the area. But also, there's an awful lot of Palestinian Christians who could then visit the site more freely. And we worked with the churches to also ensure they had full buy-in. Some of them contributed towards the cost of the clearance. As you can imagine, bringing 8 different churches together in Jerusalem is not the easiest task, and getting them to agree to something. But we did that, and I think I have a picture here of all the faiths convened with some Halo staff, and there was full buy-in from them. We eventually secured the written permission of President Mahmoud Abbas to conduct the work, and the Israeli National Mine Action Authority helped greatly by inviting the Palestinian Mine Action Centre to come and visit the site ahead of clearance and to approve the plans for clearance. So I think this is really a story of how we were able to bring a wide range of stakeholders, not necessarily with obvious mutual interest, together to complete the clearance of this site. This is what it looked like the day before we moved into start clearance. The whole area was sealed off and with danger mine signs around it. We had to work meticulously. They may not be the most impressive buildings in the world or the most ancient buildings in the world, but they are sacred and they're consecrated buildings. So we had to work with great care. And we were destroying mines very close to the churches, fortunately all blast mines, and we were able to do so without any damage. And this is the first return of the Ethiopian church to the building since 1967. You can see there'd been a lot of physical decay in most of the buildings in the 50 plus years since they were last used, but it was really quite emotional for my colleagues who'd worked on this project to be able to return with these churches for the first time and see the reactions of the various priests and monks who were returning, finding often, the property of their predecessors that had been just left as they abandoned the buildings quickly. This is Orthodox and Catholic priests and bishops coming together, and this was the first Epiphany after we'd completed clearance at the site, when the Franciscans all came and celebrated Epiphany together at the site. I'll touch also on Afghanistan, because we've done some pretty significant work around the Timurid minarets in Herat. These are 15th century minarets. They were part of a much bigger complex that is, much of which has disappeared, and landmines were laid between the minarets. This is a really prominent clearance task, and we had two archaeologists permanently attached to us as we worked to ensure that we fully protected the sites. I suppose, it's often been said that landmine clearance, especially manual clearance, is a bit of a cross between gardening and archaeology. So there are some linkages between the two, but of course we're not used to protecting that heritage. So we really did need those archaeologists alongside us to ensure that we did no harm. We've also been very fortunate to work with really strong partners in Afghanistan on these major sites. The Kabul Bala Hazar, the citadel in the city, was cleared in support of work by the Aga Khan Development Network, and this is a caravanserai in Bamiyan that we cleared working with the Turquoise Mountain. However, talking to the panel beforehand, these are all very prominent sites. And yet we've seen massive devastation in southern Lebanon, in Gaza, and across Syria. I visited last year a community in northwest Syria, where some beautiful Ottoman buildings had been badly damaged during the conflict. We don't really have a framework as Callum's touched on this at the start, we don't really have a framework to deal with the less prominent sites that are equally important. That we can't wait for decades to clear them. They're never going to sit high on the priority list for cultural protection, but they do need to be protected. So I think Callum's case that we need better guidance for our teams, practical guidance that we can live with and function with, is a really important one. I'm going to talk briefly about one more very prominent site, which is Palmyra in Syria. This is looking forward. We know from news reports that there's devastation in Palmyra, that ISIS used explosive ordnance in the site. We're not seeing huge contamination within the historic site itself. However, there will need to be EOD teams working alongside any archaeologist repairing the site. But there's extensive damage and contamination around in and around the city. So if this is going to be restored as a site for the future for Syria, a return to tourism for the country, and safe redevelopment of this area, then there'll need to be a comprehensive clearance plan in and around the city supporting the reconstruction of Palmyra. But I think the lesson I've learned already from this panel is these big sites will get done, and we'll work with them, with the appropriate authorities and with archaeologists. But we do need a framework for the small churches and the small mosques and the other fortifications and other sites that have been damaged in recent conflicts.
Thanks, Andrew. It's impressive stuff. Let me just pull Peter's presentation up. Forgive me. And there you are, Peter. Have you passed the thing along? So I've asked Peter to come and talk about the Blue Shield, the Red Cross for Cultural Property. So this is a new area for many people. It certainly was a new area for me when I joined Blue Shield, but I think it's an area where there's possible great integration between the mine action sector and the willingness or the integration of cultural property protection. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Callum. Thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I have two titles, and going in reverse order from the slide, I am the UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle University in the UK. I have to say that I do not speak for UNESCO, but that is the only such designation in the world on this topic. The organisation I can speak for, and I will speak for over the next few minutes, is the Blue Shield, an international NGO of which I am the elected president. cultural, and I'm going to use the term cultural property protection and CPP because that's the language of the 1954 Hague Convention. It's language that would now, if it had been the 1994 convention, it would have been about cultural heritage protection, but the two things are almost synonymous. It has a very long history, and I'm not going to go through that, don't worry, but it runs for about the last 2,500 years to 6th century BC China, with Sun Shao on the screen there, going all the way through. You may recognize some of the faces. I'm not going to go through them all, but on the other side from Sun Shao is Francis Lieber, a Prussian officer at the Battle of Waterloo in his youth, but became the legal advisor to the federal forces in the American Civil War. And the so-called Lieber Code is one of the major legal jump-off points for protection of cultural property, in fact, internationally. There's been about 100 years, though, of effort to get to where we are at the moment. In 1915, there was a conference in the middle of the First World War suggesting that there should be La Croix d'Or, the Gold Cross committee, created, an independent, impartial, neutral organisation to protect cultural property in conflict. And that was driven by the increased sophistication of munitions, the amount of damage being done along the Western Front, 4,000 Christian churches primarily destroyed completely along that front, and also specific attacks by both sides, predominantly the German side, on cities and urban centres. Proposed, but nothing happened. 1948, a character who is central, I think, to this, Raphael Lemkin, who created the word genocide by sticking a bit of Latin and Greek together, and drafted the early iterations of what was to become the 1948 Genocide Convention. And in those early iterations, Lemkin had two forms of genocide: barbarism and vandalism. Barbarism, genocide against people; vandalism, genocide against their cultural property, their heritage. And vandalism, in Lemkin's mind, and from studying this through history, always preceded barbarism. So could be seen as, in English we'd say, the canary in the cage. If the canary dies, if you start losing cultural property, as happened in Kristallnacht a few years after he first proposed this text, that's the critical tipping point of barbarism coming around the corner. Lemkin, unfortunately, was forced to take out the chapter on vandalism from the 48 Convention, but the idea was out, and so there were, for example, prosecutions of senior Nazis for crimes against what Lemkin would have called vandalism at Nuremberg. I can talk more about that if anybody's interested. 1952, following the Second World War, the then Director General of UNESCO suggested to those experts who'd been brought together to draft what was to become the 1954 Convention that they were there also to create an organisation that he called the Red Cross for Cultural Property. Again, nothing happened. And it was only in 1996 that an organisation, the Blue Shield, taking its name from the emblem of that 54 Convention, was created with no funding and with no legal status, but by 4 international heritage NGOs for museums, monuments and sites, libraries and archives. And the Blue Shield got its first funding, and this is the connection of why I sit here, from Newcastle University through its UNESCO chair. And since 2017, that UNESCO chair team has provided a think tank secretariat and an incubator for the development of the Blue Shield. So why is cultural property important to protect? And when I talk about cultural property, I mean both movable and immovable, tangible and intangible, and also, slightly controversially, what are called in the West cultural and natural. That's a Western concept, the division of those bits of heritage. If you ask colleagues in Africa, they will refuse to make that distinction, because all of their environment is cultural to their mind, and a point I would agree with. So why is cultural property important? It gives people a sense of place, of identity, of belonging. It contributes to their well-being, and there's fairly well-documented stuff on this, and also their dignity. So good cultural property protection can help to maintain or build healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities, the bedrock of peaceful societies. And that's what we're endeavouring to do. And in the image there's one of my colleagues and a translator talking to a museum director in Ukraine. But CPP comes with a health warning. It can be used for those peaceful attributes, but it can be, and frequently has been used as a reason for a conflict, as a target and a weapon in conflict. And we must be aware of both of those issues. The image there is of the destroyed Al-Aqshari Mosque in Samarra in Iraq in 2006. And in the period between 2003 and 2006, the Iraqi population had become increasingly upset with coalition troops still being on their streets. And there was increasing tension going on. The destruction of this mosque is seen, the third most holy shrine in Shia Islam, is seen as essentially throwing the match onto very dry kindling. And that created the 5-year full-scale sectarian civil war in Iraq, which in coalition political minds meant that coalition troops had to stay in Iraq for those 5 years, for 5 years taking casualties and fatalities. But if that's not bad enough, spending 5 years losing the propaganda war. And by losing the propaganda war, two things happened. Firstly, the organization that Saddam had fairly comprehensively destroyed in Iraq re-emerged, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And secondly, it provided the oxygen for the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. Now, neither of those organizations are going to go away in my lifetime. I'm not saying that the destruction of the Al-Aqshari Mosque was the only reason for the emergence of those two organizations, but it was a very firmly dotted line towards that action. If there is a better example of cultural property protection and the importance of it, I don't know of one. So some of the stuff that we do at the moment, we work in particular with NATO, on their exercises, putting cultural property protection problems into a military plan and strategy. We're helping them develop a policy, and we're helping them at the interface between heritage databases of culture and military ones for the so-called no-strike lists. We support similar training in many European countries and in other multinational organizations, so in Fiji and Honduras as just two recent examples. We run an annual UN training school on CPP for peacekeepers at the UN Training School in Ireland, and we contribute to a similar one at the NATO-affiliated centre in Kilkis in Greece. We did a lot of work supporting cultural workers and trying to protect cultural property on the second coming of the Taliban in Afghanistan, trying to get many of those individuals and their families out of the country. developing, working across what we call the three sectors, which I'll come back to at the end. But we see the three sectors that have to work together to deliver good CPP as the heritage sector, what we call the uniform sector, so not only armed forces, but border and custom control, police, etc., and the humanitarian sector. I'll come back to those in a moment. We've had and have ongoing projects in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, which we could talk more about. We have now formal relations with a number of international organizations, the ICRC, NATO, UNESCO, UN deployment in South Lebanon, UNIFIL, and others. And since 2017, we've done over 50 presentations in 27 countries about the importance of all of this work. Just one example of a success to give you the sort of flavour of the work we do. Blue Shield in 2011, when NATO was developing its plans for the air campaign in Libya, created a list of sites in Libya that we would prefer not to be damaged if at all possible. That got into the NATO no strike list through a variety of routes, and a NATO targeteer sitting on an airfield in the Netherlands identified 6 vehicles of a mobile communication unit loyal to President Gaddafi inside and immediately outside a large derelict building from their satellite imagery. They chose one large weapon to destroy all 6 of the vehicles and, by default, the derelict building. I don't know the detail of what happened next, but the equivalent of a red light flashed on his or her computer because the coordinates for the building, the derelict building in their eyes, were in fact the coordinates for a Roman site that we had asked not to be destroyed if at all possible. And to a targeteer, very easy to understand how they misinterpreted a Roman archaeological site as a series of derelict buildings. Decision went up the food chain, and it was eventually decided to modify the ordnance, and they used instead 6 precision weapons to destroy the 6 vehicles, the military target, but leaving the archaeological site with just a bare bit of shrapnel damage to this external face of the Roman building. That got NATO something they were extraordinarily unused to, which was good publicity. And they had so much good publicity that they set up an internal inquiry, which reported in December 2012 as to what they had done that was so good. And that resulted in NATO, the main recommendation of that was that NATO should have an alliance-wide policy on CPP. Because it's targeted to be an alliance-wide, that means you have to have full unanimous support from all members of the alliance. And I understand at the moment one of the members of the alliance is not yet convinced that NATO needs such a policy. So we're still working with them to develop the policy and to draft it as soon as the last member agrees. There are loads of issues, though. Firstly, and this is said 8 times in the Hague Convention, is that cultural property protection must start in peacetime. To leave it until a conflict starts is too late. Ask the Ukrainians. And the problem with that is that in peacetime, nobody has the time, the interest, or the funds to actually put the level of protection in place, and it is nearly always left until too late. I always say there are only 2, now possibly 3 countries in the world who have implemented the Hague Convention properly. Where we sit, Switzerland, because they always do. South Korea, because it has an imminent threat immediately to the north. And now, sadly, because of the practice it's had at all of this, Lebanon is the third. But none of this can be done with the heritage sector alone. In Lebanon, we've been working since 2013 with the Lebanese Armed Forces, the UN peacekeeping deployment, municipalities, and the Director General of Antiquities. And that is how you get good CPP done. But we must convince the others, especially those in the other sectors that I mentioned, of the importance of cultural property protection, not necessarily just because it's protecting this World Heritage Site or this national institution, but because it will help them achieve their objectives more easily, more quickly, and more effectively. And in the military stance, as said to me by a 4-star general in the US a few years ago, he was 100% behind the idea if it could stop any casualties to his, as he put it, boys and girls. So those are the things. The military are getting it, not only in the US, and the US have a very comprehensive list of cultural sites not to attack in Iran at the moment. And there has been a lot of damage to sites in Iran, but that has been nearly all down to collateral damage. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I wrote an article in 2013 that this character on the screen, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Purbrick, read and contacted me. And following a fairly long process, these are the headings of the document within the British Armed Forces that convinced the Chiefs of Staff to establish a tri-service cultural property protection unit in British forces. So campaign legitimacy, reputation, force protection and intelligence, cultural understanding. But if you don't, it can lead to the alienation of the local population and undermining force credibility. So there's one armed forces that are beginning to get the issue. So last slide, we envisage the Blue Shield now as a triangle set within a circle. Sounds a bit naff, but you'll get the idea, I hope. The triangle has, with all good triangles, 3 points. Those are those 3 sectors, heritage, humanitarian, and uniformed. And the space within the triangle is where, again, a US colonel in the Marine Corps said to me, "Oh, I get it, sir, that's where there are no stupid questions." And he got it exactly right. Those 3 sectors start from completely different points, but they all have a very similar end aspiration. In Blue Shield language, the creation or maintenance of those healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities. But that conversation that goes in within the triangle is impacted on what goes out in the outer, or goes on in the outer circle. So what's the political context? Are politicians of belligerent countries all going to abide by international humanitarian law and try and protect cultural property? Or are they going to use it as an excuse for the war, a target in the war, and a weapon in the war? Because that is obviously going to change the conversation that goes on within the triangle. In the same way, the legal context, who has ratified what national legislation is in place. And the work that we're doing with Ukraine is around that legal aspect of what can and can't potentially be prosecuted as war crimes under protection of cultural property. And then finally, well, not quite finally, then there's the media context, and I've used the example already of the failure to protect the Al-Aqshari Mosque in Samara, leading to the re-emergence of those 2 fairly horrible organizations. And then down at the bottom, the communities who we do all of this work for and who we've heard great examples of that collaboration around, but are they going to work for those sites being peaceful, or are they, perhaps during the conflict, going to be specifically targeting the heritage of people they used to live side by side in peace with? again, all of that impacts on the conversation that can happen in the triangle. And what I would like out of today and into the future is a deeper conversation with the demining community about how we can begin to work together and influence that conversation in the triangle. So I would welcome you to joining us in the triangle. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Peter. Thanks to Andrew and Steve as well. We've got about 10 minutes, and as I said before, we have some critical things that, for example, cultural heritage isn't featured at all in IMAS. But I want to give people the opportunity to ask any questions now of the audience at the moment. So, I've got a couple of hands up already. 3. Okay, great. We'll go with you, and if you could identify yourself first. Thanks.
Good morning. Christian Swan from Global Clearance Solutions. Thank you, Dr. Moore, for your presentation. Very inspiring. I have 2 quick questions. The first one is, which is the member of NATO that has not yet endorsed the directive? And the second one, a bit more structured. As commercial operators, I think that we would benefit enormously from a training dedicated, focused on the Blue Shield culture and mindset. And in that sense, I was wondering whether you have already developed a program for the commercial sector, which would enable somehow to turn the triangle into a square, adding commercial element into the picture, which is becoming more and more relevant. Of course, my comment is biased because I'm promoting the commercial sector in the humanitarian area. And in that sense, there would be, I think, a very fruitful marriage that would also have reverberating effects on the communities in which we are operating. Thank you.
Thanks. And Peter, I'm just going to collect a couple more questions, if that's all right. Nigel in the front there.
I'm Nigel Elway, Director of Revive. I'm also an advisor on the impact of explosive weapons in Parliament. Darren, you said Callum, at the beginning about doing more research in all of this. Back in 23, I organised an event very similar to this in partnership with the Culture in Crisis team at the Victoria and Albert, Professor Bill Finlay from the Archaeology Department at Oxford University, and the gentleman behind me just said commercial. We had Steve Priestley from Tetra Tech, who's done some work in this area. I've kept in touch with all of them because there is an awful lot more to this that I think we can work on. Your triangle, which had the politics on one side, you didn't have academia in amongst that. And what we're trying to do is bring academia together to provide academically robust statistics and information that we can then feed to that political audience. So I would very much welcome an opportunity to talk to you and other people in this audience about perhaps coming together and putting together some further research on that.
Thank you, Nigel. Well noted. And a final question from the gentleman in the front.
Yes, thank you. After the conflict in Armenia and Azerbaijan, there is a huge contamination, especially in Azerbaijan, and there are a lot of heritage destruction of Muslim heritage and Christian heritage. Have you worked on this conflict and this heritage? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think, and sorry, could you identify yourself? Ambassador of France, thank you. So I think actually we can follow the train of the questions and ask Peter to answer the question on NATO if he's able to. I, for one, certainly encourage the idea of a training. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more about Blue Shield's training opportunities, because certainly that's one area of collaboration we can see as well.
Sorry. On that, I don't think it is my place, unfortunately, in an environment like this to name names of big multinational organisations. So I'm not going to do that, I'm afraid. We haven't really thought in detail about what a training programme would look like for the demining community. mainly because we need the input of that community to tell us what they need, and there's obviously going to be a to and fro of what you don't know that you need and what you do know that you need and what we think you might need, etc. So we have been through that with the ICRC, and we have developed some fairly generic videos for the humanitarian sector, which might be a useful introduction for the demining community, but I think we would want to go much deeper in a specific course for you, and I would be very keen to work with any of you to develop that. Can I answer a couple of the others just very quickly? Yes, you're quite right to be talking to Culture in Crisis, although they've just moved from the V&A. The Oxford team is very good. I wish you the best of luck bringing academia together, but it's something I've never managed. But you're quite right. You do need, and we all need, robust evidence, and the image that Callum gave is one of the steps towards that, of my colleague Dr. Lisa Mole, who does a lot of work of the impact of munitions on ancient stonework and the such, and it's frequently not the impact that you can see, but it's the impact that has been caused but you can't see, that will manifest itself in 5, 10, 50 years' time as the building suddenly collapses because of the damage done because of an impact. So that's one. We haven't yet worked in Armenia and or Azerbaijan. We do work with the Armenian government, in fact, in providing support for 3D capture of sites damaged in Lebanon. And I literally this morning received some images of sites that were done in the last 12 months. And the note I got alongside these 3D images, which I haven't had a chance to look at yet, is that those 3 sites, certainly one of those sites has been completely destroyed in the last fighting, and there is a sort of despondent view that the other 2 probably have also been completely destroyed. So that work, funded by grants from Armenia and the organisation Cultural Emergency Response in the Netherlands, is now providing the only 3D representation of, or possibly providing the only 3D representation of those buildings that I have visited, all of them, in South Lebanon since 2013.
Peter, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to run on and quickly answer the question. I actually have considered the crossover between mine action and cultural heritage training, given that I'm sort of in that unique position. So we'll do some work. We're very happy to have a conversation. And the same goes for research, Nigel. In that sense, I know that, for example, GICHD have prospective grants that I would like to talk about with members of the mine action community and Blue Shield to see if we can collaborate on that further. But I'd like to sort of draw on Armenia and Azerbaijan. I know that we've got members of Halo Trust who have worked in Nagorno-Karabakh and MAG have worked in Azerbaijan most recently. And it is interesting that the convention change that I mentioned at the beginning in 2023, highlighting the importance or the issue with mines on cultural property was actually raised by Azerbaijan in the Hague Convention. But let me pass over to Andrew and Stephen if they've got any particular comments on working in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, in the past we cleared cluster munitions around Gantasar Monastery in Nagorno-Karabakh, but since Azerbaijan took control of the territory, we've not had access, so I can't comment further on that.
Yeah, similarly in Azerbaijan, we have worked on the peripheries of some cultural heritage sites, and there's a huge contamination problem in Azerbaijan. The national authorities are really willing to have international operators in the country, but to an extent, the funding picture is not looking particularly positive. So we're keen to continue the conversation on raising money for those conflicts.
Thank you, Stephen. I haven't got any other hands raised. I'm conscious we're pretty much at. We've got one other question. If people are happy with that, please go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panel. My name is Ala. I represent ICRC Libya. So as I understood, no currently framework nor policy that actually exists to protect or integrating mine action programs in the cultural heritage protection. So given that, what particular steps would you recommend for a country like Libya with heritage sites like Leptis Magna, which is considered as in danger because of the continuous conflict in the country, to being built with the authority? I mean, any particular steps that we should take to the authorities to advocate for establishing these kind of policies with international organizations? And also, is there any adaptable tools across the sector collaboration? Would you suggest that in absence of a formal framework? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. In the context of time, I'm going to give it a go to answer that one. The fact that we're having this conversation here is a marker to the point that there isn't sufficient integration. But I've been talking about this with some colleagues in the mine action sector, and I believe that there is the prospect for a technical note to be produced for IMAS. I think that is a useful piece of guidance material that could be created in, hopefully, I would consider relatively short order. I do believe that some of the training that is provided by Blue Shield would be applicable. It includes, there's a whole package of safeguarding guidance for operators in the humanitarian sector and other sectors, which I think might be useful. But certainly in terms of advocating to national authorities, the role of Blue Shield is to try to raise awareness of cultural heritage protection. That's something we would definitely be willing to assist with. But as I said at the beginning, I think there is an opportunity for us all to work together a little bit more closely, particularly in sites like Leptis Magna of huge historical importance, particularly in terms of assisting economic redevelopment in tourism, for example, for when tourists are able to revisit. So I encourage you to come and talk to us, and we can see if we can come up with further collaborations. Are there any other comments on any of that from the panel? So I just want to thank everybody for coming. As I said, it was a little bit of a on the podium for Blue Shield, but I genuinely think that given that we all work in some of these incredibly important sites for humanity's identity, that it behooves us to work a little bit more closely and try and consider opportunities for engagement. Thank you very much. Thanks to the panel, and thanks to you for coming.